When the Red Talon gang spotted black triplets walking into a diner in Pine Hollow, they saw nothing but an opportunity to hunt down easy prey. That was their job, to track down black folk and turn their suffering into sport for the wealthy elite watching from hidden cameras. Every year, the rich paid top dollar for the thrill of the hunt, placing bets on who would last the longest before the inevitable kill. The gang were hired as the first wave. Violent, disposable enforcers meant to capture and break the chosen targets before the real hunt began. But the second they made their move, everything went wrong. Their prey weren't just ordinary men. They were Navy SEALs. The Kane brothers had survived wars, torn through enemy lines, and fought battles in the deadliest corners of the world. Against them, the gang never stood a chance. In minutes, the hunters became the hunted. And this was only the beginning. The real game had yet to start, and the rich men pulling the strings had no idea that the bloodbath they had paid for was about to become their own execution. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The town of Pine Hollow sat tucked away in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest, a quiet, forgotten place where strangers stood out. It was the kind of town where the same last names stretched back generations, where new faces, especially black faces, drew long stares and murmured whispers behind store counters. Zephyrus, Kyrian, and Cassiel Kane had never cared much for small towns or the people in them. They weren't here to make friends. They had spent their entire lives moving through places like this, never staying long enough for anyone to remember them. The three brothers, identical in appearance but distinct in the way they carried themselves, had been together through wars, missions, and deployments, in places where their names had never mattered, only their skills. Zephyrus was always the calmest, the one who walked a step ahead, his sharp eyes scanning everything, his mind already plotting the best way in and the quickest way out. Kyrian, broader in the shoulders, was a storm waiting to break. His hands always curled into loose fists, like a man forever on the edge of a fight. Cassiel, the quietest of the three, never spoke unless he had to, but when he did, it was usually a warning. They had been passing through Pine Hollow for less than an hour, just a quick stop to stretch their legs, refuel, and grab something to eat. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and stale grease, the kind of place where everyone already knew they didn't belong. The waitress was polite, but her smile was tight. The old men in the corner barely pretended not to stare. Cassiel leaned back in his chair, stirring his black coffee. "We're being watched," he murmured. Zephyrus didn't glance up from the map on his phone. "We're always being watched." Kyrian smirked, shaking his head. "Yeah, but this time, it feels like someone wants to do more than stare." The doors swung open, and the three brothers instinctively glanced toward the entrance. A group of men stepped inside leather vests, steel-toed boots, tattoos creeping up their arms like twisted roots. The largest of them, with a shaved head and cold, pale eyes, gave them a slow, deliberate once-over before leaning in to whisper something to the man beside him. The Kane brothers had spent their lives recognizing threats before they happened. They had no idea that this would be the last normal moment they'd have before the hunt began. The air inside the diner felt heavier now, thick with the kind of silence that only came when something was about to go wrong. The men at the entrance, 6 of them, built like the kind of people who had never walked away from a fight in their lives, lingered just a little too long, their eyes never leaving the Kane brothers. Zephyrus remained calm, his fingers still scrolling across his phone, as if he hadn't noticed the shift in atmosphere. Cassiel, leaning forward on his elbows, didn't move, but his gaze flicked toward the reflection in the diner's fogged-up window, watching their uninvited guests without looking directly at them. Kyrian, however, was already grinning. "You see that?" he muttered, his voice just low enough for his brothers to hear. "Shaved heads looking at us like we walked into his living room uninvited." Zephyrus didn't look up. "That's because we did." A waitress hesitated as she passed the table, her nervous glance darting toward the entrance. She had been friendly enough before, but now there was something almost apologetic in her expression. The unspoken message was clear. "You shouldn't be here." The biggest of the men, the one with the pale eyes and tattoos wrapping around his thick forearms, took a slow step forward. His boots clunked against the scuffed linoleum floor. "You boys lost?" he asked, his voice carrying across the diner like a challenge. Zephyrus sighed softly, finally looking up. "No," the man smirked, but there was nothing friendly about it. His eyes flicked toward the patches on his vest, Red Talon MC, President, before landing back on them. "Thing is, you don't look like you belong here," he continued, tipping his head slightly. "Me and my guys, we don't like strangers passing through, taking up space that don't belong to them." Kyrian leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms. "That's so." Another one of the bikers, a wiry man with a long beard and a jagged scar across his cheek, stepped up beside their leader. His grin was sharper, crueler. "Yeah, that's so," he said. "And seeing as how we don't take kindly to outsiders, we figured maybe you boys want to step outside. Have a discussion." The triplets exchanged glances. They had seen this play out before. They had been stationed in countries where a few words in the wrong bar meant waking up in a ditch. They had survived ambushes, traps, and firefights more times than they could count. A bar fight wasn't a concern. It was the tone that gave it away the edge of something more calculated, more deliberate. The bikers weren't just trying to start a fight. They were testing them. Zephyrus folded his napkin and placed it neatly on the table before standing. "We don't want any trouble." Pale Eyes grinned, flashing yellowed teeth. "Then step outside and prove it." The other patrons in the diner weren't even pretending to look away anymore. The tension had shifted from unease to something closer to dread. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened here. Cassiel, still seated, exhaled slowly. "This feels off." Kyrian, already rising from his chair, rolled his shoulders. "Yeah? Well, it'd feel worse if we said no." Zephyrus adjusted the collar of his jacket, his movements slow, deliberate. "Let's not make a mess of the place," he said. "We're guests, after all." Scarface's grin widened. "That's the spirit." Without another word, the triplets followed them outside. The night air was cool, but the heat from the neon diner sign cast an orange-red glow over the pavement. Out here, away from the watchful eyes inside, the bikers shed the last bit of pretense. A few others had been waiting near their motorcycles, leaning against rusted pickup trucks, passing a cigarette back and forth. With the 6 from inside, that made 10 total. A stacked deck. The leader, Pale Eyes, tilted his head, popping the tension in his neck as he stepped forward. "See, the thing about outsiders like you," he said, "is that you don't know the rules. You pass through places you ain't welcome. You act like you're untouchable." Kyrian smirked. "You think we act untouchable?" Scarface stepped up beside his boss, cracking his knuckles. "Ain't about thinking, boy. It's about showing. So here's what's gonna happen. You're gonna take your beating like good little visitors, and then you're gonna get out of town. Maybe if we're feeling generous, we'll let you walk away from it." Zephyrus let out a slow breath, scanning the dark lot, the alleyway to the side, the layout of the street behind them. This wasn't a fight. It was an abduction. The realization was instant, sharp. The numbers weren't for intimidation. The placement wasn't accidental. The alleyway wasn't just an escape route, it was a place to drag them. Cassiel noticed it at the same time Zephyrus did. His fingers twitched toward his side, as if reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Kyrian, ever the last to care, simply cracked his knuckles. "If this is how you treat visitors, I'd hate to see how you treat each other." Pale Eyes' smirk faded. And just like that, the first punch was thrown. The moment Scarface's fist came swinging, Kyrian moved, shifting just enough for the punch to slice past his cheek. His instincts finely honed from years of training. His counter was immediate and explosive strike that drove his elbow into the biker's ribs with brutal precision, the force of impact sending a tremor through the man's body. A sharp gasp escaped him, his frame shuddering as he stumbled back, clutching his side. The fight ignited like a powder keg. Zephyrus and Cassiel were already in motion, their actions deliberate, their minds processing the battlefield with deadly efficiency. The bikers, 10 in total, had thought themselves predators, but they had just stepped into the cage with something far more dangerous. The Kane triplets weren't bar fighters or helpless drifters. They were trained operatives, forged in combat, lethal in ways their attackers couldn't begin to comprehend. A burly biker with a rusted chain wrapped around his knuckles came at Zephyrus fast, swinging it in a wide arc meant to break bone. Zephyrus analyzed the motion in an instant, reading the intent in the man's stance, the overconfidence in his swing. Instead of retreating, he stepped in, closing the distance before the chain could gain momentum, his hand shooting out to catch the attacker's wrist mid-motion. A sharp twist sent the man reeling, his own strength betraying him as Zephyrus guided him forward, using the momentum to drive his knee into his spine. The biker let out a strangled grunt as he hit the pavement hard, his own weight slamming the air from his lungs. Cassiel was a ghost, moving with surgical precision, his body slipping through the chaos like a blade through silk. When a lean, wiry biker lunged with a wild punch, Cassiel sidestepped effortlessly, allowing the man's momentum to carry him forward. With calculated precision, he caught his wrist, twisting it sharply at an unnatural angle. A sharp pop cracked through the air, followed by the biker's agonized howl as his arm bent in a direction it wasn't meant to. Cassiel released him without hesitation, his focus already shifting to the next threat. Kyrian, ever the force of raw destruction, found himself between two attackers, both lunging at once. He caught sight of a discarded tire iron near his feet, snatching it up in one fluid motion. The first biker came at him with a switchblade, the blade gleaming under the flickering streetlights. Kyrian ducked under the swipe, bringing the tire iron up in a vicious arc that cracked against the man's wrist with enough force to send the knife clattering to the ground. Without breaking stride, he spun the weapon in his grip and drove the blunt end straight into the biker's throat, cutting off his breath in a choked gag as he crumpled. A heavy-set biker attempted to tackle Zephyrus, using brute force to bring him down, but Zephyrus was already reading the play before it unfolded. He redirected the charge with an effortless pivot, gripping the man's shoulder and using his own momentum against him. With a precise shift of weight, Zephyrus threw him over his hip, sending him crashing onto the unforgiving pavement. The impact reverberated through the lot, the sound of flesh and bone colliding with cold asphalt unmistakable. Another attacker lunged for Cassiel, aiming to take him down with sheer size and power. Cassiel, ever composed, moved like water, flowing around the attack rather than resisting it. His hands moved fast, striking in precise locations. An open palm strike to the chin snapped the biker's head back, followed by a quick succession of sharp, controlled blows that left the man dazed. Cassiel finished it with a ruthless knee to the ribs, sending the biker sprawling onto the ground in a heap. For a moment, the chaos slowed. The bikers who remained standing hesitated, the realization setting in that they had made a grave miscalculation. This wasn't a simple bar fight or an easy show of dominance. They were being dissected, outmaneuvered, and broken apart piece by piece. Pale eyes, still positioned near the trucks, took a step forward, his expression shifting from amusement to something colder. His fingers curled into fists, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the smug arrogance he had displayed inside the diner. "What are you idiots waiting for?" His tone was sharp, clipped, laced with frustration. "Finish them." Kyrian wiped the blood from his knuckles against his jeans, his gaze locking onto the next wave of attackers as they hesitated. "Looks like they need motivation." Zephyrus exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, his voice even, unshaken. "Then let's give it to them." Two more bikers charged, attempting to overwhelm Kyrian. One swung wide, a telegraphed haymaker meant to end things with a single blow. Kyrian ducked under it easily, shifting his weight and driving his knee into the attacker's ribs with the force of a hammer. Before the man could collapse, Kyrian grabbed him by the collar and spun, using his body as a shield, As the second attacker lunged, the second biker slammed into his own man, staggering back, and Kyrian capitalized, delivering a brutal elbow strike to his temple that sent him crumbling like a rag doll. Cassiel picked up a broken beer bottle from the ground, the jagged edge glinting as he flipped it in his hand. A biker rushed him, arms swinging wildly, but Cassiel sidestepped with effortless grace, ducking low before rising with a precise upward slash. The bottle carved a line across the attacker's cheek, a deep crimson trail following in its wake. The biker howled, clutching his face as he stumbled back, his confidence shattered in an instant. Zephyrus dismantled another opponent with practiced efficiency, countering a wild swing with a swift knife-hand strike to the throat, sending the man gasping for air. Without missing a beat, he followed up with a calculated sidekick to the ribs, the impact lifting the biker off his feet before he crashed to the ground. The last two standing bikers wavered, fear creeping into their eyes as they exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected a fight. They hadn't expected annihilation. Pale Eyes stepped forward, his lip curled in something between frustration and admiration. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a sleek pistol, the metallic glint catching the dim light. The cold weight of it sat comfortably in his grip as he raised it, aiming directly at them. None of the Kane triplets moved. They had seen enough guns pointed at them in their lives to know when someone truly meant to pull the trigger. The silence that followed was thick, unspoken tension crackling in the air like a storm on the horizon. Then, the distant hum of an approaching vehicle broke through the quiet. Headlights cut through the darkness, beams bouncing against the pavement as a truck rumbled down the road, its tires kicking up dust as it slowed to a crawl. Pale Eyes didn't lower his weapon. Instead, his smirk returned, slow and deliberate, the glint in his eyes unmistakable, a signal. More were coming. The moment the headlights cut through the night, Zephyrus knew the fight wasn't over. The way the beams crawled slowly across the pavement, the measured pace of the truck's approach, the silent way the men inside remained unseen for just a moment, too long, everything about it confirmed what he had suspected from the start. This had never been about a simple fight. It was a setup, a calculated strategy to exhaust them, to assess them, to strip them down piece by piece until they were vulnerable enough to take without resistance. Kyrian exhaled slowly, wiping a smear of blood from his knuckles against his jeans, his grin still lingering but with a dangerous edge. He was reading the shift in the air just as well as his brothers. The men stepping out of the vehicles weren't the same leather-clad bikers they had just dismantled. They weren't the kind to come stumbling out of bars, swinging wild punches, hoping brute force would earn them dominance. These men moved with a different kind of confidence. Efficient, deliberate, controlled. Cassiel, standing slightly apart, tilted his chin just enough to catch Zephyrus's eye. The message clear between them. Mercenaries, not enforcers. Not gang members looking to reclaim their pride. These men were here to do a job. Pale Eyes remained near the trucks, his expression unreadable, his hands tucked into his pockets, as if none of this particularly mattered to him. But there was something in the way he watched them now, more analytical than before, like someone waiting for confirmation that all the pieces were finally in place. Zephyrus barely nodded, just a breath of movement. But it was enough. The shift in weight between them was instinctual, a silent signal for what came next. There was no retreat. There never had been. The mercenaries were still trying to close the gap, to box them in before engaging. But the triplets didn't wait to be surrounded. Zephyrus struck first. A soldier with close-cropped hair lunged, reaching for something on his belt, a baton, a blade. It didn't matter. Zephyrus moved before the weapon could clear its sheath, stepping inside the man's guard and locking onto his wrist. With a sharp twist, he redirected the momentum, sending the man's own arm slamming back against his ribs before driving his elbow into the soft tissue beneath the sternum. The mercenary barely had time to react before Zephyrus followed up with a devastating reverse-spinning heel kick, the force sending the man crashing into the pavement. Cassiel ghosted past another attacker, shifting effortlessly through open space as his opponent tried to predict his movement. The man swung, but Cassiel wasn't there by the time the strike landed. In a single fluid motion, he caught the mercenary's arm, twisted it backward, and delivered a precise ridge hand strike to the throat, forcing the man to stagger with a strangled breath. Before he could recover, Cassiel swept his legs out from under him and dropped a heel stomp to the chest, ensuring he wouldn't be getting up again. Kyrian wasn't finesse. Kyrian was raw, unrelenting power. A man came at him fast, baton raised, but Kyrian sidestepped at the last second, grabbed the man's forearm, and yanked him forward into a brutal judo hip throw, using the attacker's own momentum against him. The mercenary hit the pavement hard, the sound of the impact swallowed by the chaos of the fight. Before he could scramble to his feet, Kyrian lifted a metal chain from the ground, wrapped it around his fist in one smooth motion, and drove a brutal right hook across the man's jaw, dropping him instantly. They moved as one, a perfect rhythm of motion and destruction, each action feeding into the next. Another mercenary came from Zephyrus's left, quicker than the others, more trained. He feinted with one hand, the other drawing a compact stun baton meant to drop him in one hit. But Zephyrus read it instantly, stepping inward instead of away, killing the advantage of reach. He caught the wrist, twisted with precision, and drove a sharp knife-hand strike into the brachial plexus, an attack so calculated that the man's body gave out before his mind even realized what had happened. Kyrian was already dealing with two attackers at once, dodging one swing while simultaneously grabbing the other by the collar and using him as a human shield. The second attacker hesitated for half a second, just long enough for Kyrian to slam his forehead into the first man's nose, shoving him backward before spinning on his heel and landing a vicious spinning back kick to the second. But even as they dismantled their opponents with ruthless efficiency, Zephyrus could feel something else creeping in at the edges. The mercenaries weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to delay. And then he saw it. The first canister rolled across the pavement, hissing as it released a nearly invisible cloud into the air. Cassiel reacted immediately, holding his breath, but the second canister came from behind, cutting off their escape route. Kyrian coughed once, then again, his steps faltering slightly. His balance was still there, but it was off. His movements a fraction too slow. Zephyrus felt it too, the sudden, unshakable fog settling over his thoughts, making his limbs feel heavier. Not a tranquilizer, at least not a direct one. That would have been too obvious, too immediate. This was measured. This was calculated. They had planned for this. Cassiel twisted, trying to break free from two mercenaries closing in on him, but his body wasn't responding the way it should have. His grip slipped, his stance faltered just for a breath, and that was all it took. A quick, efficient strike to the side of his head, followed by a needle pressing into his neck. He went still, blinking once as his body struggled against what had already entered his system. Kyrian growled, thrashing as hands closed around him, fighting even as his legs buckled beneath him. He managed to throw one attacker off, swinging wildly, but his movements were sluggish now, his power still present, but his speed compromised. Another hand clamped onto his shoulder, then another, and then the familiar sting of something piercing his skin. Zephyrus fought harder, knowing it was futile. He twisted, struck, countered, but they had prepared too well, waited for their moment too precisely. Even as he managed to elbow one man across the face and knee another in the ribs, the sharp sting of a needle against his arm finally made its mark. Through the haze, he saw pale eyes watching, his smirk slow and satisfied, hands still in his pockets. "You fought well," he murmured, crouching slightly to meet Zephyrus's gaze, watching as his body struggled to stay upright. But at the end of the day, everyone falls the same way. Kyrian, still on his knees, gasped, his breathing uneven. "You... cheating... coward!" Pale eyes patted his cheek mockingly. "Don't fight it now." Just let it happen. Zephyrus fought to stay conscious, but the drug pulled him under, his vision fading into darkness. Cassiel's body sagged, his resistance vanishing as the sedative took hold. Kyrian let out a final, ragged snarl, his muscles twitching before giving way. The last thing they heard was the slam of truck doors, the hum of engines in the distance. The hunt had begun. The first thing Zephyrus felt was the cold, a damp chill that clung to his skin and seeped into his bones, dragging him back to consciousness with a slow, creeping awareness that something was wrong. His head ached with the lingering effects of the sedative, a dull throbbing that pulsed behind his eyes, disorienting him for just a moment before instinct took over, forcing him to push past the haze clouding his thoughts. His fingers flexed against the damp earth beneath him, feeling the uneven texture of dirt and scattered leaves, his senses adjusting to the rough, natural terrain. He inhaled deeply, steadying his mind as he processed the crisp bite of the air, the distant scent of pine, and the subtle but unmistakable traces of oil, sweat, and something metallic lingering just beneath it all. The distant rustle of movement pulled him further from the fog of unconsciousness, his ears picking up the sound of shifting weight, controlled breathing, and the subtle scrape of fabric against the forest floor. His brothers were waking up as well. Cassiel, always the first to regain full awareness, sat up slowly, his movements careful and measured despite the last remnants of the drug still dulling his body. Kyrian was stirring next, his return to consciousness much sharper, his breathing deeper, heavier, his frustration bleeding through as he forced his muscles to obey. The moment he realized their situation, his body tensed, his shoulders rolling back as if preparing to lunge into a fight that wasn't there yet. Zephyrus didn't need to say anything. They had all reached the same conclusion, in the same breath. They had been taken, stripped of their weapons and gear, left with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and placed somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere meant to disorient them. A crackle of static cut through the silence, the distorted hum of a speaker hidden somewhere among the trees. The voice that followed was low, smooth, and laced with amusement, the mechanical distortion stretching the words just enough to make them unnatural. "Run, little lambs. The game begins now." Zephyrus's head lifted slightly, his gaze sweeping across the treetops, immediately searching for the source. But the sound bounced, making it impossible to pinpoint. Before he could process the full implications of the message, another noise reached them. This one softer, but just as telling. The subtle hum of machinery whirred overhead, a sound so faint that most people wouldn't have noticed it through the rustling of leaves and the distant chirp of insects, but to trained ears, it was unmistakable. Drones. Cassiel was the first to spot them, his gaze lifting toward the sky, catching the faint glint of reflected light against metal. Small, almost imperceptible against the darkness, they hovered just above the treetops, shifting angles in synchronized movement as their lenses adjusted, tracking their every motion. "They're broadcasting," Cassiel muttered, his voice low, steady, his mind already piecing together the logistics of their situation. Kyrian exhaled sharply, following his brother's gaze as his hands curled into fists at his sides, tension rippling through his body with restrained aggression. "They took everything, dropped us in the middle of nowhere, and now they want us to run. They're putting on a show." Zephyrus remained still for a moment longer, his eyes narrowing slightly as he turned the thought over in his mind. This wasn't just a manhunt. It was an event, something structured, controlled, and prepared long before they had even stepped foot in that diner. The speaker crackled again, the same mechanical voice returning with a sickening sense of delight. 5 minutes, little lambs. 5 minutes before the hunt begins." Kyrian shifted his weight slightly, his frustration now edged with something sharper. "They're giving us a head start." Zephyrus inhaled slowly, his mind moving past the immediate frustration and into strategy. "Not out of generosity," he murmured, his voice calm, collected, and completely devoid of fear. They don't need to chase us. They already have our location. The drones are for observation, not tracking. That means the hunters are waiting somewhere close, watching from a distance, waiting for their signal to move. Cassiel, still watching the sky, tilted his head slightly as his mind worked through the same conclusions. That also means they aren't using thermal tracking, or else they wouldn't need this kind of setup. They're relying on sight, sound, and movement. His gaze flicked back down to the ground, assessing the dirt beneath them, searching for something only he could see. The terrain is unaltered. No artificial paths, no preset obstacles. It's real wilderness. He paused briefly before nodding toward the thinning mist that clung to the air. Higher altitude, colder air pressure. We're in the mountains, probably deep northwest. Zephyrus gave a small nod. Barely emotion at all. That works to our advantage. They're betting on fear, on disorientation. If they wanted a straight kill, they would have done it before we woke up. They want us to make mistakes. Cassiel met his gaze, the corner of his mouth barely twitching. Then we don't. The speaker crackled again, almost taunting. 4 minutes. Zephyrus turned toward the tree line, already mapping their movements in his head. We don't run in a straight line. They expect that. We move toward elevation. Find higher ground. Force them to come to us on our terms. If we're forced into a chase, we control the field, not them. Cassiel glanced toward the shifting density of the forest ahead, eyes tracing possible obstacles, natural cover, potential kill zones, a ravine, rock formations. Anywhere they'll have to funnel through. If they want to track us, they'll have to go where we want them. Kyrian exhaled slowly, rolling out his shoulders as if shaking off the last traces of the sedative still lingering in his system. His body was already settling into the fight, the old, familiar energy of combat pulling him into the only state of mind he had ever truly felt at home in. We're not running from them. His voice was low, almost amused now. They just don't know it yet. Zephyrus met his gaze, then Cassiel's, reading the unspoken understanding between them. They had spent their whole lives as hunters. No matter how many guns their enemies had, no matter how many traps had been set, no matter how many men were watching from the shadows, that fact had never changed. The voice returned, each word dragging out just slightly, as if savoring the moment. 3 minutes. Without another word, they moved as one, disappearing into the trees without hesitation, their footsteps light against the earth, their bodies slipping into the shadows. The drones overhead adjusted their angles, tracking their movement, following their path with a quiet, mechanical hum. The game had started. The watchers above leaned closer. The men waiting in the darkness gripped their weapons. The first bets had already been placed. And somewhere beyond the trees, the hunters prepared to move. The night pressed in around them, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, the quiet hum of insects, barely audible beneath the steady, mechanical whir of drones gliding overhead. The forest was alive with movement, but none of it came from the cane triplets. They had melted into the landscape, their bodies moving with precision through the dense foliage, their steps careful, controlled. The weight of the unseen eyes tracking them from above meant nothing. The real danger wasn't in the air, it was on the ground, creeping through the darkness, believing itself to be the predator. Zephyrus moved ahead, his senses tuned to every detail, mapping the terrain as he read the landscape like a battlefield, already plotting their next move. Cassiel kept to the shadows, his movements fluid, his sharp eyes scanning the trees, seeking angles, looking for the first signs of pursuit. Kyrian stayed close, but slightly off-center, his energy coiled, waiting, anticipating the inevitable confrontation. They didn't need to speak. The moment the distorted voice had counted down to 0, they had known what came next. The hunt had begun. They had spent a lifetime being hunted by enemies, by war, by the weight of missions that never existed on paper. But never like this. Never for sport. The first hunter moved through the trees with careful steps, his rifle angled low, his head tilting as he listened. He was confident, expecting easy prey, expecting fear. He had no idea how wrong he was. Zephyrus saw him first. The subtle flicker of movement in the distance, the shape of a man moving with caution, but not experience. He could tell immediately that these weren't just average mercenaries. These were wealthy hunters playing at being soldiers, men who had probably paid for military training but had never faced a real battlefield. Their gear was advanced, their weapons high grade, but their posture gave them away. They expected this to be easy. The hunter lifted a hand, signaling to someone unseen. But before he could take another step, Cassiel moved like a shadow behind him, a single precise motion, one smooth arc of movement, and the hunter's breath hitched as a blade slid deep into his throat. There was no struggle, no sound beyond the sharp exhale of dying breath before Cassiel eased him to the ground, keeping the body from making noise. Zephyrus was already stripping the hunter of his radio earpiece, tactical knife, and sidearm, keeping his movements quick, efficient. Kyrian, crouched low beside them, exhaled quietly. They're overconfident. Too spread out. They don't think we can fight back. Zephyrus secured the stolen weapon, his gaze scanning the darkness. Then they don't deserve to be here. The second hunter came from the right, his steps cautious, his head tilting as he peered through the trees. He reached for his radio, but before he could press the button, Kyrian struck. The attack was brutal, swift, a hand clamping over the hunter's mouth, an arm locking around his throat, pulling him back into the shadows as he struggled for air. Kyrian held him tight, keeping him pinned as the man's thrashing grew weaker, his body buckling as oxygen slipped from his lungs. The moment he went limp, Kyrian let him drop soundlessly to the ground. Blood smeared across his knuckles as he wiped them against his pants. His jaw clenched, his voice low and sharp. "They're not hunting us. We're hunting them." The third and fourth hunters didn't even see the attack coming. Cassiel and Zephyrus moved in tandem, their strikes synchronized, taking them down with a precision that left no room for reaction. A blade to the ribs, a silenced shot to the head, and two more bodies fell into the dirt, their presence erased before they could warn the others. Kyrian picked up one of their rifles, flipping it over in his hands before slinging it across his back. "That's 4 down. What's the play?" Zephyrus pulled a radio from one of the fallen men, listening briefly to the static before pocketing it. "They don't know we're fighting back yet. We use that." Cassiel was already searching the ground, his fingers tracing the earth. "There's a natural bottleneck up ahead. Rocky terrain, thick underbrush. If we force them through, we control the approach." Zephyrus nodded, his mind working through the next steps. "We don't just set a trap. We make them believe they have us cornered." They moved quickly, using the dense foliage to their advantage, gathering materials for what they needed. They worked without speaking, their actions synchronized, their understanding of each other unspoken, but absolute. Cassiel rigged a tripwire between 2 trees, using thin strands of vine and scavenged materials from the hunter's own gear, ensuring it would be nearly invisible in the darkness. Kyrian coated the ground with slick mud, using a small canister of oil pulled from one of the fallen men's pouches, making sure any hunter who stepped wrong would lose their footing. Zephyrus placed a stolen earpiece in the dirt, a quiet radio signal playing just loud enough to draw them in, to make them believe they were closing in on a survivor. The first wave had walked in, believing their targets were defenseless. The second wave would be made to suffer for that arrogance. Miles away, in the safety of a remote surveillance room, a drone operator adjusted his controls, his eyes narrowing at the screens in front of him. The live feed from the hovering drones should have shown 3 untrained men running for their lives. Instead, the thermal signatures told a different story, one that didn't make sense. The prey wasn't behaving as expected. There was no frantic movement, no desperate sprint for safety, no erratic patterns of men running for their lives. Instead, the figures on the screen remained steady, their positions shifting with calculated precision rather than panic. The operator's fingers hovered over the controls as confusion settled over him. Something was wrong. The supposed targets weren't running at all. They had stopped moving entirely. And worse, they hadn't just stopped. They had positioned themselves in a way that didn't resemble disorientation or hesitation. The layout of their thermal signatures on the drone feed showed something disturbingly familiar. A formation, a defensive stance, a controlled perimeter designed to contain and control movement. The drone operator hesitated for a moment, his mouth suddenly dry as he switched to the communications channel, his voice carrying an edge of uncertainty as he relayed what he was seeing. "I think we have a problem." The radio crackled, the response immediate, impatient, and clipped with irritation, as though the man on the other end had no interest in complications. "Then, handle it." The operator's grip tightened around the controls, his pulse quickening as the weight of the realization settled over him like a slow, creeping chill. His eyes remained fixed on the screen, watching as the three heat signatures moved, not with the frantic desperation of hunted men, but with the deliberate, controlled discipline of trained killers setting a trap. These men weren't prey. They were something else entirely. The forest remained still, save for the whisper of wind through the branches and the quiet hum of drones circling overhead, their lenses locked onto the scene below, watching, waiting, recording every moment as the second wave of hunters advanced. They moved with more caution than the first group, their formation tighter, their weapons drawn and ready, the false confidence of their predecessors stripped away by the eerie silence that surrounded them. They had expected to hear gunfire, the sounds of a desperate struggle, the telltale chaos of prey trying to survive. Instead, there was nothing. No frantic movement, no heavy breathing over the radio, no sign of pursuit, only the quiet, suffocating weight of an enemy they couldn't see. They were walking straight into the kill zone. Zephyrus remained motionless, pressed against the thick trunk of a fallen tree, his breathing slow, controlled, barely stirring the air around him. He could hear them now, the faint rustle of boots against the undergrowth, the careful way they moved, adjusting their positions as they advanced through the forest. They were trained, more disciplined than the first group, but they still didn't understand what they were up against. They were scanning for movement, waiting for an ambush they assumed would come from desperation. But they weren't facing men who ran when cornered. They were facing men who thrived in the shadows. Cassiel crouched low behind a ridge of rock, his fingers skimming over the damp earth, feeling the vibrations of their footsteps before he even needed to see them. His gaze flicked upward, locking onto Zephyrus for the briefest second, a silent exchange passing between them. There were 6, all closing in, spreading out slightly in an attempt to flush them out, their tactical lights slicing through the darkness. Kyrian remained hidden within the thick brush a few feet away, his body coiled, waiting for the signal. His pulse was steady, his breath even. The old, familiar energy of combat settled over him, the kind that made his muscles loose, his movements fluid. These men thought they were prepared. They thought their numbers and training would be enough. They were wrong. The first one stepped too close. Cassiel moved first, emerging from the dark with the kind of speed that made it look effortless. His hands latched onto the hunter's weapon, twisting the barrel downward as he pivoted, yanking the man forward while driving his elbow into the soft tissue of his throat. The hunter staggered, his own momentum betraying him as Cassiel slammed his knee into his ribs, forcing the air from his lungs before sweeping his legs out from under him. By the time the man's body hit the ground, Cassiel was already pulling the suppressed pistol from the hunter's belt, spinning it in his palm as he delivered a clean, precise shot into his skull. Zephyrus struck next, catching the second hunter mid-step, his movements quick and merciless. He intercepted the man's swing, parrying the rifle upward before stepping inside his guard and driving a vicious ridge-hand strike against his carotid artery. The hunter's body jerked, his knees buckling from the sheer force of the blow. Before he could collapse, Zephyrus grabbed him by the vest, spinning him around and using his body as a human shield just as another hunter fired blindly into the dark. The bullets struck his fallen ally instead, the wet sound of impact lost beneath the chaos. Zephyrus used the moment of confusion to slam the muzzle of his stolen rifle beneath the shooter's jaw and pull the trigger. Kyrian was already moving before the bodies hit the ground. He launched himself at the next attacker, dropping low before driving his shoulder into the man's midsection, lifting him off his feet and slamming him into a tree with a sickening crack. The hunter gasped, the impact stunning him long enough for Kyrian to yank his knife from its sheath, flipping it in his grip before plunging the blade between the man's ribs in one brutal motion. The hunter's body twitched once before going still, the blood soaking into Kyrian's hands as he let him drop. The remaining two hunters hesitated, their confidence finally cracking. One of them reached for his radio, trying to signal for help, but Cassiel was already aiming down the stolen pistol's sights. A single silenced shot rang out, hitting him clean through the skull. The last man turned to run. Zephyrus let him, for about 3 seconds. Then, in a single practiced motion, he lifted the rifle, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The fleeing hunter barely made it 3 steps before the bullet tore through the back of his skull, dropping him face first into the dirt. The forest returned to silence. Kyrian exhaled, wiping his bloodied hand against his shirt as he crouched beside one of the bodies, searching through the hunter's gear with quick, practiced movements. They came loaded. This one's carrying maps. He flipped one open, scanning the detailed markings. Looks like they've got multiple positions mapped out: supply points, rendezvous zones, entry points. These cowards came in prepared. Zephyrus took an earpiece off one of the fallen men, slipping it into his ear. Static crackled for a brief second before voices came through muted conversations, chatter in hushed tones, the sound of men coordinating movements. But beneath it all, there was something else. Silence. Not the silence of men waiting. The silence of men realizing something was very, very wrong. Miles away, inside a lavishly furnished surveillance room, Lucian Wexler leaned forward in his chair, his fingers steepled together as he watched the live feed from the drones. His expression remained impassive, unreadable, but there was something in his posture, something just beneath the surface, that spoke of irritation, of a plan beginning to fray at the edges. Bishop Rourke, standing beside him, folded his arms, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smirk. "That's a lot of bodies for an opening round," he mused, his tone laced with dry amusement. "You sure you picked the right players for this?" Lucian's gaze flicked toward the screens again, watching as the 3 heat signatures disappeared into the trees. Not running, not panicking, but moving with the same controlled efficiency as before. He exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening slightly. "This was supposed to be a hunt?" he murmured, his voice quiet, measured, but edged with something dangerously close to displeasure. Bishop's smirk widened slightly. "It still is, just not the one we planned." Lucian didn't answer immediately, his fingers tapping once against the arm of his chair as he watched the live feed. After a long moment, he finally spoke, his tone unreadable. "Send in more." The forest stretched wide and silent around them, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, a waiting presence that carried the weight of something unseen. The triplets had moved fast, retreating into the shadows just as the first distant crackle of radio chatter signaled incoming movement. They had been careful, precise, stripping the fallen hunters of their gear, salvaging what was useful while leaving behind the remnants of another failed attempt to put them down. The supply drop had been their next step, a calculated decision rather than an act of desperation. The game's architects had expected them to run, but running had never been an option. Zephyrus crouched just beyond the clearing, his back pressed against the thick trunk of a fallen tree, his eyes locked onto the camouflaged crates stacked beneath the tarp. He could see the movement of shadows stretching long in the dim moonlight, the shapes of men navigating the terrain with calculated steps, their weapons raised, their attention sharp but unfocused. They had assumed control of this hunt from the beginning, had designed it as a spectacle to be observed and wagered on from a safe distance, But their miscalculation had been simple. The triplets weren't entertainment. Cassiel moved low, staying within the blind spots of the automated turret mounted near the tree line, its sleek barrel shifting slightly as its sensors scanned for threats. His hands moved quickly, rewiring the motion detection system, adjusting the settings just enough so that when the next wave of hunters stepped into range, they would no longer be recognized as friendly. There was something clinical about his efficiency, the way he worked without wasted motion, knowing exactly what needed to be done without question or hesitation. Kyrian worked fast, prying open the nearest crate, sifting through the contents with sharp, deliberate movements. Assault rifles, tactical gear, encrypted radios, standard issue for men who expected an easy kill. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head as he pulled out a pack of detonators, tossing one to Zephyrus without a word. There was no need for conversation. The plan was already in motion. Zephyrus secured the charges, placing them deep within the stacks, adjusting the delay triggers so that the explosives wouldn't detonate immediately. They weren't here to make noise. They were here to send a message. The moment the next team arrived, eager to resupply and regroup, they would be met with nothing but fire and death. Cassiel finished his work, slipping back toward the others just as a static-filled voice crackled through the stolen radio Kyrian had secured. The conversation was clipped, sharp, carrying the first hints of frustration, the kind that came when things were no longer unfolding according to plan. Squad 3, push forward to supply point Bravo. Resupply and hold position until further orders. Kyrian smirked, slipping the radio into his pocket. They're coming! Let's see how well they handle disappointment. They moved quickly, retreating into the tree line, their steps light against the earth, their bodies blending seamlessly into the dark. There was no need to linger. By the time the first set of boots touched the ground, the trap would already be sprung. The drones hovering above adjusted their angles, tracking their movement as they disappeared back into the forest. In the distance, the first flickers of approaching headlights cut through the trees, engines humming low as reinforcements rolled in. The hunters weren't finished. The game's architects weren't finished. Lucian Wexler sat motionless, his fingers drumming lightly against the polished armrest of his chair, his gaze fixed on the screens before him. The live drone feeds projected the game in crisp clarity, revealing the heat signatures of the three men moving with unwavering precision, their path deliberate, controlled. He had been watching them closely, studying their tactics, analyzing their decisions, but the moment the supply drop erupted into a wave of fire and concussive force, the controlled expression on his face hardened. Bishop Rourke leaned against the far wall, arms folded across his chest, a slow smirk playing at the edges of his lips. Well, he mused, watching the flames lick hungrily at the sky, the dark silhouettes of hunters thrown back by the blast. That wasn't supposed to happen. Lucian remained silent for a long moment, his jaw tightening slightly as the explosion faded into flickering embers on the screen. He exhaled through his nose, calm but measured, his mind already recalculating. Raise the bounty. Bishop lifted an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly. By how much? Lucian's fingers stilled against the armrest, his voice cool, decisive. Double it. Bishop let out a low whistle, his amusement never quite leaving. That's a lot of money. You sure that's the play? Lucian's gaze remained fixed on the monitors, watching as the triplets moved deeper into the forest, their presence like shadows cutting through the game board he had designed. They weren't moving like men on the run. They weren't moving like prey. They had their chance to run, he murmured, more to himself than to Rourke, his voice edged with something quieter, something colder. They chose war instead. His fingers moved smoothly over the console, switching to a secure frequency. His next command delivered with the weight of finality. Bring in the specialists. Rourke pushed off the wall, rolling his shoulders, his smirk widening slightly. Now that's more like it. The forest stretched on, dark and endless, the hum of drones overhead blending into the whisper of wind cutting through the trees. The triplets continued moving, their pace steady, their focus unwavering. They had set the stage. They had sent the message. Now they were waiting for the next move, and when it came, they would be ready. The forest had settled back into an uneasy quiet, the kind that wasn't natural, the kind that only came when something was moving beneath the surface, something unseen but undeniably present. The triplets kept moving, their pace measured, their eyes scanning for shifts in the terrain, reading the land as instinctively as a wolf tracks its prey. The last explosion had sent a message, loud and clear, but there was no satisfaction in it, only the knowledge that this was far from over. Zephyrus listened to the soft crackle of the stolen radio, the encrypted frequency still feeding him bits of information, fragmented voices shifting between channels. There was no more casual chatter, no relaxed exchanges between men who believed they were in control. That thin layer of arrogance had been burned away with the supply drop. Now, there was something else, tension, then a voice. Deeper, sharper than the ones before. All remaining squads, hold position. Alpha and Omega teams are en route. Establish perimeter and wait for orders. Zephyrus exhaled slowly, passing a glance toward Cassiel, who had already heard it, already processed it. Kyrian, moving slightly ahead, rolled his shoulders, his posture shifting, the familiar, restless energy creeping in like an old habit. They finally stopped sending amateurs, Kyrian murmured, his voice edged with something that wasn't quite a smirk. Good. I was getting bored. Cassiel didn't look away from the path ahead, his tone quiet but firm. They won't be like the others. Zephyrus nodded, his mind already shifting into preparation. No, they won't, but neither are we. They moved carefully, keeping low, keeping to the thickest parts of the brush, but the air had changed. The scent of the forest was the same, the night just as dark, but the presence of the new arrivals had shifted the energy of the game. The triplets had spent their entire lives recognizing when trained men entered a battlefield, and whoever had just arrived wasn't some weekend warrior playing at survival. These were professionals. The first sign of movement came from the east, a faint distortion in the tree line, almost imperceptible, but enough for Zephyrus to register the presence of men who knew how to move without being seen. No wasted steps, no unnecessary noise, no careless shifts in balance. The men advancing through the forest weren't just soldiers, they were hunters in their own right. Cassiel paused, his head tilting slightly, his sharp gaze locked onto the shadowed figures creeping forward. They're tracking us, but they don't want to engage yet. Kyrian exhaled through his nose, adjusting his grip on the stolen rifle slung over his shoulder. Then let's give them a reason. The first strike was theirs. Zephyrus moved first, his body slipping through the darkness with practiced ease, his approach undetectable until the very last second. The first elite hunter had barely turned when Zephyrus locked onto him from behind, his arm wrapping around the man's throat in a crushing rear-naked choke. The hunter reacted fast, slamming his elbow backward, aiming for Zephyrus's ribs, but Zephyrus absorbed the impact, tightening his hold, cutting off oxygen, cutting off the fight before it could even start. The hunter struggled, his body jerking as he clawed at Zephyrus's grip, but it was too late. His strength faltered, his movements slowed, and within seconds his body went limp. Cassiel struck next, emerging from the brush with silent precision, his blade flashing once before sinking deep into the kidney of a second hunter. The man gasped, his body convulsing, but Cassiel didn't let him fall. He used the momentum, pivoting, twisting, and dragging the blade upward, severing vital arteries, ensuring there was no chance for recovery. The hunter gurgled something unintelligible before Cassiel eased him onto the ground, his expression unreadable as he wiped the blade clean. Kyrian didn't wait for silence. He went straight for the next hunter, closing the distance fast, his footsteps heavy, deliberate. This time, the enemy saw him coming, a former Marine, judging by the way he held his weapon, the way his stance shifted the moment he registered an immediate threat. But Kyrian was faster. The hunter swung, knife flashing toward his throat, But Kyrian caught the wrist mid-motion, twisting it in a brutal wrist lock before driving his knee into the man's ribs. The Marine grunted, trying to pivot, trying to regain control. But Kyrian didn't give him a chance. He used the momentum, flipping the man over his shoulder and slamming him onto the dirt with enough force to break bone. The Marine rolled, scrambling to recover. But Kyrian was already moving again. A brutal stomp to the back of the head ended the fight instantly. Zephyrus barely had time to adjust before another hunter descended from above, dropping from the trees in an aerial attack, a tactical knife gleaming in the moonlight. He reacted in an instant, his forearm shooting up to block the incoming strike, redirecting the force before using the leverage to spin the attacker mid-air, sending him crashing sideways into the trunk of a tree. The man grunted, trying to push off, but Zephyrus was already there, driving an elbow into the base of his skull, knocking him unconscious before he could even hit the ground. The forest fell still again, the tension thick, the realization settling in. The specialists had entered the game believing themselves to be the apex predators. They had been hand-selected, former operators, men who had spent years mastering their craft, men who had walked through war and survived. But the moment they had stepped into this battlefield, they had made the same mistake as the ones before them. They had assumed they were the hunters. Kyrian wiped the back of his hand across his cheek, the faintest smear of blood lingering against his knuckles, his breathing steady, his body loose but charged with energy. He rolled his shoulders once before speaking, his voice carrying through the trees, sharp and certain. "This isn't your jungle." Cassiel tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable as he observed the motionless bodies around them. "This isn't your hunt." Zephyrus exhaled, adjusting the rifle strap across his chest, his gaze locking onto the shifting movement deeper in the forest, where the remaining elite hunters were still circling, still waiting, still believing they had the advantage. He shook his head once, his voice calm, deliberate. "You were dead the second you stepped into our world." They moved again, disappearing into the trees before the next attack could come, leaving only the bodies behind, leaving only the realization that this game was no longer in anyone's control. The night air carried the faint, acrid scent of gunpowder, mingling with the rich, damp earth and the metallic bite of blood still fresh in the underbrush. The forest had become something else entirely. No longer a battlefield dictated by the rules of the hunt, but a graveyard littered with the bodies of men who had believed themselves untouchable. The triplets moved carefully, their bodies coiled with unspent energy, their eyes scanning the darkness, listening for the inevitable next wave. And it came. The low rumble of engines growling in the distance was the first sign, the unmistakable mechanical snarl of motorcycles weaving through the terrain, their headlights flickering like vengeful ghosts through the thick of the trees. The Red Talon gang, bruised, humiliated, and stripped of their previous arrogance, had entered the battlefield, no longer content to watch from the sidelines while the game spiraled out of control. Zephyrus crouched behind a thick, fallen log, his grip firm around the stolen rifle slung across his chest, his sharp eyes locking onto the shadowed figures now dismounting in the distance. They had come heavy semi-automatics, makeshift body armor, and an anger that ran deeper than pride. This wasn't about sport anymore. It was about saving face, about reclaiming their power, about proving they weren't the ones being outmaneuvered by 3 men who should have been dead hours ago. Kyrian exhaled, rolling his shoulders, his voice low but edged with dark amusement. "Guess they didn't like what we did to their friends." Cassiel, ever the strategist, barely flicked a glance at the terrain before speaking. "They're too loud. They don't move like the others. They're trying to flush us out, not hunt." His gaze lingered on the men now fanning out, searching, their footsteps too heavy, too eager. "That makes them weak." Zephyrus's lips barely twitched. "Then we end it." The first shot rang out, a burst of gunfire shattering the stillness as one of the gang members fired blindly into the trees. the loud, echoing crack a sharp contrast to the calculated silence of the professionals who had come before. The triplets had fought men like these before, men who mistook rage for skill, who thought intimidation was a substitute for discipline, who believed that numbers gave them power. They were wrong. Zephyrus moved first, his body slipping between the trees with surgical precision, his rifle raised, his breath steady as he fired 2 clean shots, each one finding its target before the gang even registered the attack. The first man staggered, a sharp, wet gasp tearing from his throat as he collapsed against the base of a tree, blood spreading in dark rivulets down his chest. The second barely had time to turn before a round punched through his sternum, dropping him to the forest floor. Cassiel had already flanked wide, his movements swift, controlled. A Red Talon lieutenant barked orders, his gun sweeping the darkness as his voice rose in frustration. But before he could react, Cassiel was behind him, a knife flashing in the moonlight before sinking deep into his ribs, severing the artery with clinical precision. The man stiffened, choking on his own breath as Cassiel wrenched the blade free, guiding the body down without a sound. Kyrian, on the other hand, didn't care for silence. He launched himself into the fray, gripping the nearest biker by the back of the skull and driving his knee into his face with brutal force, the crunch of bone shattering beneath the impact. The body dropped limply, but Kyrian was already pivoting, swinging the stolen rifle like a club and smashing the butt of it into another man's jaw, sending him sprawling. The next attacker lunged wildly, a rusted machete gleaming in his grip, but Kyrian sidestepped, caught the arm mid-swing, and twisted, snapping the elbow backward with a sickening pop. The gang member howled in agony, but the sound was cut short as Kyrian drove a bullet into his skull at point-blank range. The chaos was fast, a brutal symphony of movement and gunfire, but it was over just as quickly as it had begun. The bodies lay scattered in the underbrush, the gang's numbers cut down in minutes, their arrogance buried beneath the weight of their own failure. Zephyrus took a breath, reloading his weapon as his gaze swept over the carnage. There was no movement, no survivors. Red Talon had been wiped from the board. Cassiel exhaled, his voice calm, final. That's done. Kyrian tilted his head, listening, his sharp eyes flickering toward the distant hum of drones overhead. He exhaled a slow breath, wiping his bloodied hand against his jeans before speaking. They're watching. They saw all of that. Zephyrus nodded. Good. Miles away, Lucian Wexler's expression had darkened. His fingers curled so tightly against the edge of his desk that his knuckles had gone white. The live drone feed flickered across the monitors before him, replaying the footage in cold, clinical detail. The Red Talon gang had entered the field with the intent to restore order, and instead, they had been erased like an afterthought. Bishop Rourke let out a quiet whistle, tilting his head slightly as he observed the aftermath. That wasn't even a fight. That was an execution. Lucian's jaw tightened, his mind already racing past what had just happened, calculating what came next. He had underestimated them. He had allowed himself to believe that the men he had placed inside this hunt were in control, that the game was still unfolding as planned. That mistake was now costing him. They're not going to stop, he murmured, watching as the triplets disappeared back into the darkness, their bodies slipping away like ghosts, untouched, unbroken. Bishop leaned forward slightly, the ever-present smirk on his lips still lingering, but there was something else behind it now, something sharper. Then it's time to stop playing. Lucian exhaled, cold calculation settling over his features as he reached for the secure console beside him. His next words came without hesitation, without doubt. Pull the remaining teams. Call for an extraction. Bishop lifted a brow, amusement flickering in his gaze. Getting nervous? Lucian's voice remained steady, unreadable. We're no longer controlling the hunt. They are. He leaned forward, pressing a button that cut the drone feed to black, his next command delivered with absolute finality. They're coming for us. The night stretched on, thick with the scent of charred wood and blood, the remnants of the last battle fading into the stillness of the forest. The triplets moved carefully, keeping to the dense underbrush, their bodies tuned to every shift in the environment. They had taken down wave after wave of hunters, dismantling their ranks with precision. But it wasn't enough, not yet. The hunt hadn't ended. The men pulling the strings were still out there, watching from a distance, treating this entire battlefield like a personal game board, adjusting the pieces as though the lives they played with held no weight. Zephyrus led the way, his gaze sharp, scanning every inch of the terrain as they moved. The triplets weren't running. They were hunting. Somewhere ahead, just beyond the next ridge, the faint glow of flickering red lights pulsed through the trees, casting eerie patterns against the darkened leaves. The drone had fallen here, its sleek frame tangled in the thick undergrowth, its mechanical hum sputtering weakly as its systems attempted to reboot. Cassiel crouched first, his hands moving with careful efficiency as he examined the wreckage. The drone wasn't heavily damaged, a miscalculation on the operator's part, a sign that whoever had been controlling it hadn't anticipated just how quickly the triplets could dismantle their resources. The fall had severed the main rotor, but the core remained intact, its transmission still cycling through encrypted channels, desperately trying to reconnect to the main server. Korean ran a hand down his face, exhaling through his nose as he scanned the tree line. They know we're here. They've been watching. They won't let us play with their toys for long. Zephyrus had already started working, his fingers moving over the cracked casing of the drone, peeling back the reinforced plating to expose its internal components. Then we won't take long. Cassiel leaned in, his sharp eyes scanning the wiring, reading the frequency shifts on the dimly flickering control panel. This was more than just a camera feed. This was an uplink, a direct connection to the network that controlled every part of the hunt. Kyrian huffed a quiet laugh, crouching beside them as he pulled a stolen hunting knife from his belt. What do you think? Simple encryption, or did they actually put some effort into this? Cassiel didn't answer immediately. His fingers danced over the exposed circuit board, pulling a cracked fiber-optic cable from the relay and linking it to a salvaged military-grade decryption tool they had lifted off one of the fallen hunters earlier. The screen flickered, the first waves of distorted code scrolling in chaotic lines, symbols shifting as the device began to peel apart the security layers one by one. Zephyrus kept his eyes on the screen, his voice low but certain. They've done this before. Cassiel barely nodded, his focus unwavering as he navigated the system, shifting between firewalls and rerouted proxy networks. A lot more than once. The screen flickered again, and then the floodgates opened. The first layer of encrypted files collapsed, revealing an extensive directory: names, locations, timestamps, payment logs. It wasn't just one hunt. It was dozens, maybe hundreds. Each name carried a tag beside it, most labeled terminated in cold, final lettering. Some were categorized as incomplete, others marked as special requests, the implications behind the words sickeningly clear. This wasn't a singular event. It was an industry. Kyrian's face darkened as he scrolled through the list, his jaw clenching tighter with every name. They've been doing this for years. Zephyrus's gaze sharpened as he flicked to another file: coordinates, real-time location data still actively transmitting. The hunt wasn't being managed from a random off-site control center. The people responsible were close. Cassiel's hands stilled over the keys for half a second before he shifted to the next directory. Financial records, wire transfers, silent investors. This wasn't just a blood sport. It was an entire system, deeply embedded, protected by men with too much money and too little conscience. Zephyrus's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of something final. If we don't burn this place to the ground, there will be others. Cassiel nodded once, his eyes still locked on the screen. There already have been. Kyrian exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against the hilt of the knife still gripped in his hand. Then, let's make sure there won't be any more. Zephyrus disconnected the relay, severing the uplink before the operators could trace their movements. They had what they needed. The coordinates were burned into his mind, the location of the facility now within reach. The men watching from the other side of the screens had no idea that their prey was no longer trying to escape. They were coming for them. Miles away, inside the high-security compound where the hunt had been orchestrated, Lucien Wexler stared at the blacked-out drone feed, his jaw tight, his fingers curled into the armrests of his chair. The system had gone dark. The last transmission had been hijacked. Bishop Rourke exhaled a slow breath, rubbing his chin as he watched the silent monitors, his ever-present smirk dimming slightly as the realization settled over him. "I take it that's bad news." Lucien didn't answer immediately. His mind worked through every scenario, every failsafe, every last thread of control he had believed was unbreakable. He had seen men fight back before. He had seen men try to escape, try to resist, try to rewrite the script. But this was different. This wasn't resistance. This was retaliation. He stood slowly, his movements measured, the cold certainty of the situation weighing on him. "It's over." Bishop arched a brow. "I doubt that." Lucien turned, his gaze locked onto the distant monitors, the encrypted screens that once displayed their perfect game, now nothing but static. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was an edge to it, a finality that couldn't be ignored. "They have our location." Bishop's smirk returned, but this time there was something else behind it, something that recognized the game had shifted for the last time. Lucien reached for his communicator, his next order delivered without hesitation. "Lock down the facility. No one gets in." Bishop's smirk widened. "I don't think that's going to be the problem." Lucien exhaled, his patience thinning as he watched the static flicker across the screens. "They're coming." The compound was buried deep beneath the earth, hidden beneath layers of concrete and steel, an architectural fortress designed to keep outsiders from ever knowing what took place inside its walls. The entrance was carefully disguised as a private estate on the surface, a mansion with manicured gardens and a facade of old-world wealth. But beneath it, the truth was much uglier. The real facility stretched downward, secured behind biometric access points, motion-sensitive corridors, and an army of hired men who believed their job was to protect something untouchable. Zephyrus crouched against the outer wall, his eyes locked onto the narrow service entrance, the point they had identified as the weakest link in the facility's defenses. Unlike the main entrances, where armed security operated with full surveillance, the service tunnels were staffed with fewer men, technicians, maintenance workers, and logistical personnel who weren't expecting a fight. Cassiel adjusted the collar of the stolen uniform, his sharp eyes flicking toward the security rotation schedule they had lifted from one of the fallen hunters earlier. He had already memorized the shift patterns, the guard rotations, the blind spots in the surveillance feed. There were gaps, small but exploitable. If they moved now, they could slip in unseen, blending into the controlled environment rather than forcing their way through. Kyrian exhaled, rolling his shoulders beneath the weight of the uniform he had taken from one of the facility's men earlier, the fabric still carrying the faint scent of cologne and sweat. His hands flexed at his sides, itching for action, but he kept his stance casual, loose. They had learned long ago that the best weapons weren't always drawn in open combat sometimes. They were hidden in plain sight. Zephyrus spoke low, his voice barely above a breath. "We go in quiet, no mistakes." Cassiel gave a small nod, already moving first, his posture shifting seamlessly into the controlled, indifferent stride of an employee who belonged there. Kyrian followed, adjusting the stolen badge clipped to his chest, keeping his shoulders relaxed, his gaze sharp but unreadable. Zephyrus came last, his movements smooth, practiced, blending into the rhythm of the facility rather than disrupting it. The first set of guards barely looked at them, their attention fixed on their assigned posts, their minds dulled by routine. Security cameras tracked every hallway, but Cassiel had studied their coverage before they had even stepped inside. He had memorized where they overlapped, where they lagged, where the system had built-in delays. They moved accordingly, slipping through the gaps like shadows, using the architecture itself as camouflage. They didn't need brute force. They needed precision. Zephyrus spotted the first real obstacle at the end of the corridor, a security checkpoint, where an armed guard stood at the access panel, monitoring the ID scans of everyone passing through. There was no way to avoid it. They had to go through. Cassiel barely hesitated as he stepped forward, his expression unreadable, his movements perfectly controlled. The guard barely glanced up, his attention flicking toward the badge hanging from Cassiel's uniform, his mind too preoccupied to register that something was wrong. The silent takedown was over in seconds. Cassiel's left hand struck first a sharp, precise palm strike to the guard's larynx, cutting off his voice before he could make a sound. Zephyrus moved at the same time, his grip closing over the guard's wrist, twisting the gun from his hand, disarming him before he could react. Kyrian yanked him backward into the shadows, his arm wrapping around the guard's throat, cutting off his oxygen in one smooth motion. The man struggled for only a few seconds before his body sagged, unconscious. Cassiel stepped past him, swiping the stolen ID across the access panel. The door hissed open. They were inside. The corridor widened, leading into the heart of the facility, where the hunt's true architects remained blissfully unaware that their game was ending. The sound of murmured conversation, the clinking of glasses, the dull hum of a luxurious private lounge filled the air. The wealthy elites, the spectators who had been watching the hunt from their gilded thrones, were still gathered, still enjoying their entertainment as though nothing had changed. They had no idea that the men they had tried to kill were now walking among them. Kyrian's jaw tightened as he scanned the room, his gaze flicking over the plush leather chairs, the crystal tumblers filled with aged whiskey, the large monitors still displaying the drone feeds. Even now, they were watching the aftermath of the hunt, their expressions entertained, detached. Cassiel's voice was steady, quiet, carrying the weight of finality. "We end this now." Zephyrus nodded once, before turning sharply, heading for the surveillance room, the nerve center of the operation. Inside, rows of monitors lined the walls, showing live feeds from the drones, motion trackers, encrypted communication logs, everything used to control the hunt in real time. The technicians inside barely had time to react. Zephyrus moved first, slamming the butt of his stolen weapon into the nearest man's skull, knocking him unconscious before he could sound the alarm. Cassiel followed, delivering a sharp, brutal blow to the second operator's throat, silencing him instantly. Kyrian grabbed the last man, shoving him forward and pressing the barrel of a pistol against his temple, his voice calm but unrelenting. "Shut it down." The technician hesitated, his fingers trembling over the keyboard. Kyrian didn't ask twice. The emergency shutdown code was entered within seconds. The monitors flickered, the live feeds cutting out one by one, the drone cameras disconnecting, the security systems collapsing. But that wasn't enough. Zephyrus tapped into the broadcast relay, overriding the encryption, rerouting the system to an external feed. The screens came back to life. Only now, they weren't just transmitting to the private audience of the wealthy elite. They were broadcasting everything: the hunt, the victims, the names of the past games, the money trails, the unfiltered truth directly to the outside world. Government agencies, law enforcement, independent journalists, everyone who had been kept in the dark was now watching. Cassiel stepped back, his gaze locked onto the monitors, watching as the realization dawned in the eyes of the elites still lounging in the private chamber, the weight of what was happening sinking in. Kyrian exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "They're not watching a game anymore." Zephyrus's voice was quiet, but firm. "No, they're watching the end of it." The triplets turned, stepping away from the control room, ready for the final confrontation. The moment the facility's security feeds flickered back online, revealing the triplets in the surveillance room, Bishop Rourke knew. Not because it had reached its natural conclusion, not because the men in charge had decided to call it quits, but because the ones who were supposed to be prey had flipped the board entirely. He stood in the center of the operations room, his hands resting on the reinforced table as the grainy feeds displayed chaos, unraveling in real time. The control room was compromised, the private broadcast had been hijacked, and the eyes of the outside world had just been pried open to every sick, twisted truth buried inside these walls. And yet, Bishop wasn't panicking. He smiled. Slowly, he exhaled through his nose, his fingers drumming idly against the table as the security teams crackled through his earpiece, their voices tight with fear. He had fought against a lot of dangerous men in his life. He had seen killers, warlords, and mercenaries break under pressure. But this was the first time he had seen an entire operation come apart at the seams in less than an hour. He tilted his head slightly, his voice calm as he pressed the radio to his lips. All units, fall back to defensive positions. Seal off all exits. If they came all this way, let's not waste the opportunity to kill them properly. A voice on the other end stammered, hesitation bleeding into every word. Sir, Bishop's smirk disappeared. That wasn't a request. There was silence for a long beat. And then the remaining forces moved into position. If the triplets wanted a war, then he would give them one. Zephyrus led the way out of the surveillance room, his movements smooth and deliberate, his mind already several steps ahead as he mapped the quickest route toward the control center. Cassiel followed close behind, his gaze sharp, cataloging every hallway, every tactical vantage point, every path their enemies could use to funnel them into a trap. Curian, at their flank, flexed his grip on the stolen rifle, his body loose but charged with the familiar hum of adrenaline. They all knew what was coming, the final stand. The hallway ahead stretched long and silent, the air thick with the tension of men waiting just beyond the next corner, anticipating their advance. Zephyrus could feel it, could hear the subtle shifts of weight against the floor, the faint clicks of fingers adjusting on triggers. Cassiel moved first, his steps light, precise, his body shifting low as he slipped a small reflective mirror from his vest, angling it carefully toward the intersection ahead. The moment it caught the glint of waiting gun barrels, he didn't hesitate. 7 waiting, rifles up, close formation. They're expecting us to rush in. Curian exhaled sharply, shifting his stance. That's a shame. I was hoping they'd put up a fight. Zephyrus didn't speak. He moved. The first wave of gunfire ripped through the air, bullets slicing through the walls, kicking up debris, but the triplets had already adjusted. Zephyrus dove forward, dropping low, sending a clean shot straight into the leg of the nearest gunman before rolling behind cover. The man collapsed, screaming, and before his allies could react, Cassiel launched forward, ghosting into their formation, slipping between bodies like a phantom. The first man barely registered his presence before Cassiel jammed a stolen knife straight into his diaphragm, twisting it sharply before using the momentum to spin the body as a shield. Curian moved with a force like a wrecking ball, gripping a fallen gunman by the vest and hurling him straight into 2 others, using sheer strength to knock them into the ground. He followed with a brutal stomp to the chest, a sickening crunch filling the hallway as ribs cracked beneath his boot. Zephyrus reloaded mid-movement, sliding behind another fallen enemy, firing 2 clean headshots before pivoting and snapping the rifle butt into the face of the last standing guard. It was over in seconds. Cassiel wiped the blood from his blade before tucking it away, his breathing even. They'll send more. Zephyrus glanced at the heavily reinforced doors at the end of the hall, his gaze narrowing slightly. Good. They moved again, their boots silent against the steel flooring, their focus unshaken. Another hallway, another wave. More bodies, more men who had no idea they were already dead. Bishop Rourke was waiting at the heart of it all. The security doors leading into the final control chamber hissed open, revealing a massive room lined with servers, dimly glowing monitors, and a row of armed men standing between the triplets and the last obstacle in their way. Bishop stood at the center, his posture relaxed, his head tilting slightly as he exhaled, studying them like they were the most interesting thing he had ever seen. Most people would be dead by now, he mused, rolling his shoulders as he stepped forward, completely at ease, despite the bloodbath that had led to this moment. You boys must be real special. Kyrian exhaled, cracking his knuckles. You talk too much. Bishop chuckled, shaking his head. And you still don't get it. You think this is about survival? About payback? About tearing this place apart? He spread his arms wide, his smirk unwavering. That's just a side effect. The real game? It's already over. Zephyrus didn't flinch. You're right. It is. Cassiel didn't hesitate. The first shot shattered the tension. Bishop's men opened fire, the air exploding into a storm of bullets. But the triplets were already moving, already breaking formation, flanking, shifting, dismantling the opposition with the kind of efficiency that had left battlefields littered with the corpses of men who had thought they stood a chance. Bishop grinned as he lunged forward, his body a blur of violent motion. A predator meeting predators head-on. The control center was in ruins, a battlefield of shattered glass and flickering screens, their static hum cutting through the suffocating silence left in the wake of destruction. The once sterile walls were now painted with blood, the aftermath of a war that had dismantled the very foundation of the hunt. The triplets stood at its epicenter, their bodies marked with bruises and blood, their breathing steady despite the chaos they had wrought. And yet, amidst the wreckage, Bishop Rourke remained standing. Unlike the others, he had not fallen to panic, had not fled in desperation, had not wasted his last moments begging for his life. He stood with the ease of a man who had been here before, who had walked through fire and come out the other side more dangerous than he had been before he entered. His knuckles were bloodied, his tactical shirt torn at the edges, but there was no fear in his stance, no hesitation in his gaze. He lifted a hand to wipe a smear of blood from the corner of his mouth, before rolling his shoulders, letting out a slow, measured exhale, as though he were preparing for nothing more than another round in a fight he was built for. You should be proud, he said, his voice calm, almost conversational, despite the wreckage around him. Most men don't make it past the first day, but here you are. You flipped the whole game on its head. He tilted his head slightly, his sharp eyes scanning their postures, assessing, calculating, searching for even the smallest weakness. But now, it's just me. And you. And we both know how this ends. Kyrian scoffed, adjusting his grip on the rifle slung across his chest. Yeah, with you on the floor. Cassiel, ever the strategist, narrowed his gaze, noting the way Rourke's weight rested evenly on his feet, the way his muscles remained loose, but coiled, ready to strike. The former Special Forces operative was not simply waiting for them to make a move. He was preparing. Zephyrus took a single step forward, his voice steady, carrying the weight of something final. You had your chance to walk away. Rourke's lips curled into a slow, wolfish grin, the flicker of amusement never quite reaching his eyes. Walk away? He chuckled, shaking his head. Boys, you still don't get it, do you? His shoulders dropping ever so slightly as he loosened his stance. He wasn't posturing, he was getting ready. I didn't come here to win. I came here to fight. And then he moved. It was a blur of motion, a flash of muscle and instinct sharpened by years of combat experience. Rourke lunged, closing the distance between them in a fraction of a second. His first strike a deceptive feint, a flicker of movement meant to draw Zephyrus's attention to his left hand, while his right fist came in like a hammer. Zephyrus barely had time to block, his forearm absorbing the brunt of the impact as the force rattled through his bones. He countered immediately, snapping his knee forward in a calculated strike to Rourke's ribs, but the seasoned fighter twisted with the momentum, deflecting the blow just enough to minimize the damage before launching his next attack. The next series of blows came fast, brutal, and unrelenting. A sharp elbow aimed for Zephyrus's temple. A knee strike meant to cripple. a devastating palm thrust toward his throat. Zephyrus weaved between the attacks, each dodge razor close, the air shifting around him with the sheer force of Rourke's strikes. He blocked what he could, absorbed what he couldn't, and retaliated with a precise counter, a ridge hand chop to the throat, a crushing elbow to the jaw, a low kick meant to take out Rourke's stance. But Rourke was too fast, too experienced, too good. The moment Zephyrus's weight shifted for the next strike, Rourke caught his wrist, twisting it violently, using Zephyrus's own momentum against him. In one fluid motion, he pivoted, dragging Zephyrus off balance before slamming him onto the hard floor with a ruthless efficiency that spoke of years of mastering close-quarters combat. Zephyrus hit the ground hard, his lungs seizing for a fraction of a second as the impact radiated through his spine. Kyrian and Cassiel instinctively moved to intervene, but Zephyrus lifted a single hand, stopping them in their tracks. This was his fight. Rourke exhaled, smirking as he rolled his shoulders back into place. Not bad, but I expected better. Zephyrus pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the dull ache spreading through his ribs. His mind was already recalculating, adjusting, adapting. Rourke fought with overwhelming force, relying on aggression and precise brutality, but aggression was also a weakness. Every attack burned, they clashed again. Zephyrus adapted, shifting from counterstrikes to relentless pressure. He let Rourke exhaust himself. The moment the former operative threw another high-impact strike, Zephyrus stepped inside the attack, deflecting the punch before retaliating with a vicious elbow to the solar plexus. Rourke staggered for the first time. Zephyrus didn't let him recover. He followed up with a sharp knee to the sternum, a brutal hammer fist to the back of the skull, and a final crushing ridge hand to the throat. Rourke gasped, his body faltering. His hands instinctively went to his neck, desperate for air, but Zephyrus didn't give him time to catch his breath. With calculated precision, he hooked his arm around Rourke's throat, using his own weight against him, twisting sharply in a maneuver designed to break balance and cut off oxygen. Rourke struggled, fought, but the outcome was already written in the way his body sagged, the last of his strength draining as his vision darkened. For the first time, he looked up at Zephyrus from his back. For the first time, he was the prey. Blood trickled from his split lip, his breathing ragged, yet he still smirked, even as his body betrayed him. "You," he coughed, voice hoarse. "You're a real killer, aren't you?" Zephyrus stared down at him, his expression unreadable, his breathing steady despite the fight. "I'm nothing like you." With a final, precise movement, he ended it. The last predator fell. Silence hung over the wreckage. The only sound, the distant crackle of flames licking at the edges of the facility. Cassiel surveyed the scene before flicking his gaze to Zephyrus. "That's done!" Kyrian wiped blood from his knuckles, exhaling slowly. One left. Zephyrus didn't hesitate. His gaze was already fixed on the last locked chamber where Lucien Wexler had disappeared the moment the fight had begun. No more games. The hunt, the power, the control, all of it was gone. Wexler had built an empire on blood and deception. But now, there was nowhere left to run. He was next. The triplets weren't chasing him anymore. They were coming to end him. The triplets moved with precision, their bodies synchronized in a way only years of combat could refine. Lucien Wexler was running. They had seen this before, the way men like him reacted when their carefully constructed worlds collapsed. First, they controlled the board. Then, when they began to lose their grip, they negotiated. And when there was no power left to wield, they ran. But there was nowhere left to run. Zephyrus led the charge, his boots pounding against the scorched ground as he pushed forward, his focus honed to a singular point: the helipad. The thudding rotors of Wexler's private helicopter were already slicing through the night air, kicking up dust and embers as it prepared for takeoff. Cassiel tracked Wexler's movements, scanning for any last-minute defenses. "He's going to cover his tracks," he muttered, his mind racing through the possibilities. No way he leaves without trying to erase everything first, and scoffed, gripping his rifle tightly. Then we don't let him leave at all. They pushed forward through the last security checkpoint, emerging onto the airstrip. The landing pad stretched before them, bathed in the cold, artificial glow of floodlights. The helicopter waiting at the far end, its engines roaring louder by the second. And at the open hatch, barking final orders to his pilot, stood Wexler. For a man who had spent his life dictating the fates of others from behind a screen, orchestrating death as a spectator sport, he looked startlingly human now. His perfectly tailored suit was wrinkled, his face slick with sweat, his hands shaking just slightly as he reached for the chopper. For the first time in his life, Lucien Wexler wasn't in control. Zephyrus raised his rifle and fired. The bullet ripped through the air, slamming into the control panel of the helipad's security gate, disabling it in an instant. The blast sent a shower of sparks cascading onto the tarmac as the heavy doors groaned open, no longer standing between them and their prey. Two guards turned at the noise, their weapons rising, but they were too slow. Cassiel was already moving, slipping through the shadows like a ghost, closing the distance in a single breath. His blade flashed under the floodlights, a clean, controlled strike slicing through the first guard's throat before the man even registered his death. Zephyrus dropped the second with a precise double tap to the chest, his movements seamless. Wexler flinched at the sudden violence, his body jerking back toward the open hatch. The pilot hesitated, waiting for a signal, a single word, and the aircraft would lift off. But the order never came, because Kyrian was already there. He grabbed Wexler by the collar, yanking him back with raw, unforgiving strength before slamming him against the side of the helicopter. The aircraft's metal frame shuddered from the impact, the sound nearly lost beneath the deafening roar of the rotors slicing through the night air. The force of the hit sent a sharp jolt through Wexler's body, and for a brief second, his fingers clawed for something to hold on to. But Kyrian wasn't letting go. Not this time. Wexler struggled, his movements frantic, desperate. He twisted violently in Kyrian's grip, his body jerking sideways in an attempt to break free. His breath came in sharp, uneven bursts, his mind racing for a way out. Survival was all that mattered now. He lashed out suddenly, his knee driving upward, aiming for Kyrian's ribs. The strike was quick practiced, but Kyrian saw it coming. He twisted just in time, absorbing the impact along his thigh instead of his ribs, gritting his teeth as the force radiated through his leg. Wexler tried again, this time throwing his entire weight forward in a desperate attempt to slip free. His fingers clawed at Kyrian's wrist, prying, twisting, fighting. Then he lunged for the helicopter hatch, his hands stretched toward the rail, his last chance to escape. But Zephyrus moved faster. With the precision of a trained warrior, Zephyrus intercepted him, stepping into his path with perfect timing. His leg shot out, a sharp, well-placed strike to the back of Wexler's knee. The impact broke his balance instantly, forcing his body forward just enough that his outstretched fingers missed the rail by mere inches. He barely had time to react before he was crashing onto the tarmac. Wexler hit the ground hard, rolling with the impact, his body twisting as he scrambled to push himself back up. Blood trickled from the side of his mouth where his teeth had split his lip upon impact. But he ignored the pain, his survival instincts screaming louder than the agony in his bones. Cassiel anticipated his next move. He took a step forward, ready to strike if necessary, but Wexler was already thinking ahead. A knife flashed in his hand. The blade was small, sleek, nearly unnoticeable in the dim lighting. But Wexler wasn't wielding it recklessly. He was trained, precise, a man who knew how to kill with speed and silence. Without hesitation, he slashed upward. A swift, lethal motion aimed directly at Zephyrus's throat. Zephyrus reacted on instinct. He shifted his weight, stepping just far enough to the side that the blade only grazed past him, the sharp edge slicing through the air, missing by a fraction of an inch. Kirian didn't wait. He moved in with brutal efficiency, grabbing Wexler's wrist before the knife could be repositioned. In one powerful motion, he wrenched Wexler's arm downward, twisting it sharply until the blade clattered to the ground. Before Wexler could retaliate, Kirian drove a crushing punch into his ribs, the force of the blow forcing a ragged gasp from his throat. Wexler crumpled onto the tarmac, gasping for air, his forehead pressed against the cold ground as his body trembled from the force of the hit. His entire frame sagged under the weight of exhaustion and defeat, and above him the triplets stood bruised, bloodied, but unbroken. They were the storm that had come to swallow him whole. And for the first time in his life, Wexler looked afraid. But only for a moment, because Wexler wasn't just a coward, he was a manipulator. Even as his body struggled to keep up, his mind was still working. His thoughts were already spinning, searching, recalculating. There was always a way out. There had to be. His breath steadied. The fear flickered for a second, but then vanished, replaced by something calmer, colder, more familiar. "You've won," he admitted, his voice even, composed, as if he were merely conceding a chess match instead of standing in the ruins of his empire. He exhaled slowly, deliberately, as if none of this mattered. His tone remained smooth, measured even with a gun pointed at his chest. "I'll give you that," Kirian scoffed, shaking his head as he wiped the blood from his knuckles. "If you're about to beg, don't." Wexler's smirk returned, faint but still present, just a flicker of amusement beneath the exhaustion weighing down his frame. "Beg?" He let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. No, that's not my style." Cassiel said nothing, his sharp eyes locked onto Wexler, watching, waiting. Wexler inhaled deeply, straightening as much as he could. His hands twitched slightly before smoothing out his tattered suit, brushing imaginary dust from his cuffs. It was almost ridiculous, the way he still carried himself like a man who had control. "But I have to wonder, do you really think you've won?" His gaze flicked between them, assessing, searching, his tone dipping into something silkier, smoother, the same quiet charm that had built his empire. "You didn't just take down a facility," he continued. "You didn't just stop a hunt. You disrupted an entire ecosystem. You think this is the only one? The game doesn't end just because you flipped the board over." He let the words settle, his smirk growing slightly. "Another will rise. Another hunt will start. The market will always demand blood." Cassiel remained unreadable, his expression unmoving. "Then we'll burn that one too." Wexler exhaled a quiet laugh, as if amused by the very idea. "Maybe," he mused, "but you won't be able to stop them all." He took a step forward, deliberately ignoring the weapons still trained on him. He moved as if he wasn't standing in the wreckage of his own empire, as if he wasn't already a dead man walking. "But you don't have to burn it down." His voice lowered, taking on a quiet temptation, a whisper of something forbidden. "You can own it." Kirian's fingers curled into a fist, his jaw tightening. Wexler saw the reaction, pressed further. "Think about it," he continued, his voice carrying that same eerie calmness. "You outmaneuvered the best. You're not just soldiers, you're kings. You want power? I can give it to you. You want control? You can have it. We can reshape this from the inside." His eyes locked onto Zephyrus, sensing the leader, the decision-maker. "Or you can burn it all down, walk away with nothing, and let someone else rebuild it in your absence." Silence settled over the airstrip, heavy, thick, waiting. Zephyrus studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable, his breath steady despite the fight, despite the weight of everything that had come before this. Then he stepped forward, closing the space between them, forcing Wexler to tilt his chin up just to meet his gaze. His voice was quiet, firm, absolute. "We're not like you." Wexler's smirk flickered. Kirian yanked him from the helicopter, throwing him onto the tarmac with force. The pilot hesitated for only a moment before gripping the controls and lifting off without him. Wexler staggered to his feet, his face twisting with fury. You think you've changed anything? He spat, his voice raw, desperate. You think this ends with me? And then alarms blared. A security failsafe activated, triggered by Wexler's own desperate override of the system. Cassiel's eyes flicked toward the facility behind them, its remaining servers flashing with warning signs, error messages cascading down the cracked screens. Wexler's calm expression faltered. Kyrian tilted his head, his knuckles flexing. You just hit the wrong button, didn't you? A low rumble vibrated beneath their feet. Distant but growing. Wexler's breathing hitched as he realized what he had done. Zephyrus exhaled, rolling his shoulders as he set his stance. Looks like we're not finished after all. A deep, metallic groan rumbled beneath their feet, the ground vibrating as the facility's structural integrity gave way to the fire now consuming it from within. Sparks rained from flickering floodlights, casting jagged shadows across the airstrip. The distant security towers blinked red with emergency sirens, warning that the inevitable collapse was only moments away. Lucien Wexler stood between them and the flames, his carefully manufactured composure finally slipping, replaced by something more primal. His breathing was uneven, his hands twitching as he processed the reality that his own arrogance had triggered the countdown to his empire's destruction. And yet, even now, he refused to surrender. Kyrian cracked his knuckles, stepping forward, his muscles coiled with the anticipation of violence. You ran out of moves, Wexler. Wexler exhaled slowly, his hands flexing as he adjusted his stance. Gone was the smooth, controlled executive. In his place stood a man who had prepared for this. I built this empire, he said, his voice eerily calm despite the chaos around him. I didn't do that sitting behind a desk. Then he moved. Wexler lunged at Kyrian first, his attack swift and deliberate, his fist shooting forward in a feint, baiting Kyrian into blocking high only to shift, twisting his body mid-motion to deliver a devastating knee toward his ribs. Kyrian caught it just in time, absorbing the impact as he staggered back. The force was heavier than expected. Wexler knew how to fight. Zephyrus closed the gap instantly, striking with a brutal elbow aimed for Wexler's temple. Wexler deflected, twisting Zephyrus's momentum into a counter-grapple, attempting to lock his arm and dislocate his shoulder. Cassiel intercepted, a precise kick snapping toward Wexler's side, forcing him to break the hold and retreat. Wexler exhaled sharply, rolling out his shoulders. There was no fear in his eyes now, only focus. You think I climbed to the top without knowing how to survive? He muttered, adjusting his footing. You think I haven't fought men deadlier than you? Kyrian scoffed, shaking out his arms. We're about to find out. They clashed again. Kyrian moved first. A series of rapid strikes and body shots meant to break through Wexler's defenses. The blows landed, but Wexler absorbed them, rolling with the impact, using the force against Kyrian rather than resisting. He struck back fast, an uppercut to the ribs, a sweeping low kick aimed at destabilizing Kyrian's stance. Kyrian dropped his weight, slamming a forearm into Wexler's knee, disrupting the follow-through. Zephyrus exploited the opening, darting in with a brutal ridge hand strike to the throat. Wexler twisted at the last second, barely dodging, but Cassiel was already weighting his knee, driving into Wexler's exposed side, sending him crashing onto the tarmac. The moment he hit the ground, a massive explosion rocked the facility behind them. Flames erupted from the collapsing structure, tearing through steel and concrete, sending shockwaves across the airstrip. The helicopter, still hovering just beyond the fight, tilted violently as the blast wave sent a fiery gust through the air. Zephyrus stepped forward, staring down at Wexler, his breathing measured. You're done. But Wexler wasn't finished. He planted his hands against the tarmac and pushed off the ground, launching himself upward with a force that defied his earlier exhaustion. His palm shot out, striking Zephyrus's sternum in a sudden, calculated blow meant to disrupt his breathing. Zephyrus staggered. Wexler didn't waste a second. He grabbed Zephyrus's wrist, twisting it into a joint lock, spinning him toward the helicopter. The moment Zephyrus's back was turned, Wexler kicked the back of his knee, forcing him to drop. Kyrian roared as he charged, swinging a powerful hook. But Wexler ducked under the attack, rolling onto his feet and using the momentum to slam his elbow into Kyrian's spine. Cassiel leapt from behind, attempting a takedown, but Wexler twisted at the last second, using Cassiel's own movement to hurl him toward the burning wreckage. Cassiel's boots scraped against the ground, barely stopping himself before he hit the wall of flames. Zephyrus straightened, rolling his shoulder back into place, his expression unreadable. "You're good," he admitted, stepping forward again. Wexler wiped blood from his mouth, his lips curling into something almost smug. "I don't just pay killers," he murmured. "I learn from them." Another explosion erupted, a section of the facility crumbling inward, sending a cascade of fire and debris crashing down onto the runway. The triplets didn't slow. They surrounded Wexler, forcing him into a corner as the flames licked higher, the air growing thick with heat and smoke. Kyrian feinted forward, and Wexler reacted instantly, striking out with a brutal counter. But it was a trap. Zephyrus was already moving, stepping into Wexler's blind spot. He drove a vicious, precise knee straight into his ribs. Wexler gasped as the impact rattled through his body, but before he could recover, Cassiel delivered a bone-snapping elbow to the side of his face. He stumbled, his vision blurring, but still, he fought. With one final act of defiance, Wexler roared, pushing forward, his movements no longer calculated, but desperate, animalistic. The triplets saw it. They knew the fight was reaching its peak. Another blast rocked the ground beneath them. The landing pad buckled from the strain of the fire raging through the foundation. Zephyrus dodged as a piece of flaming debris crashed between them and Wexler, splitting the battlefield into two. Wexler, blood dripping from his forehead, stared at them through the smoke. His once confident smirk was gone, replaced by something raw, something unhinged. "You think this ends with me?" he growled, his voice hoarse from the smoke filling the air. Kyrian exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "It ends tonight." The next move would decide everything. And as the fire burned around them, the final battle began. Flames roared around them, hungry and consuming, licking at the airstrip as the facility behind them crumbled under its own destruction. The inferno cast jagged shadows across the tarmac, the helicopter's fading rotor wash whipping embers into a frenzied storm. And in the center of it all, Wexler fought like a man who refused to die. He struck first, his body a blur of sharp, controlled movement, his palms slicing through the air like a blade. He aimed for Kyrian's throat, fast, precise, an attack meant to crush his windpipe. Kyrian leaned back just in time, barely avoiding the strike before countering with a low, sweeping kick aimed at Wexler's knee. Wexler saw it, adjusted, twisted. He leapt, his body weightless for a split second, twisting midair in a maneuver that defied expectation. He flipped over Kyrian's extended leg and landed effortlessly, pivoting into a vicious backhand strike toward Zephyrus. Zephyrus blocked, his arm absorbing the hit with a dull thud before twisting Wexler's wrist into a brutal joint lock. Wexler didn't resist the redirect. With a sudden, fluid counter, he twisted beneath Zephyrus's grip, breaking free, his feet barely touching the ground before he rolled into a seamless follow-up attack. His knee shot forward, targeting Zephyrus's sternum, but Zephyrus deflected at the last second, twisting his body away. Cassiel was already moving. He struck from behind, his movements swift and ghost-like, his elbow cutting through the smoke-filled air, aiming for Wexler's temple. Wexler ducked at the last second, catching Cassiel's strike with an open palm before flipping his entire body forward, using Cassiel's momentum to throw him. Cassiel landed in a controlled roll, pushing off the ground instantly, his muscles fluid and efficient as he righted himself. His eyes locked onto Wexler again, this time with newfound precision. They moved in unison now, the triplets adapting to Wexler's unpredictability. Kyrian feinted left, forcing Wexler to shift. Zephyrus exploited the hesitation, his footwork masterful, launching into a high-snap kick toward Wexler's ribs. Wexler barely managed to block, but Cassiel was already waiting, sweeping Wexler's legs out from under him. Wexler hit the ground hard, but instead of staying down, he rolled backward, flipping onto his feet with the fluidity of a man trained in survival. The ground beneath them rumbled, the fire inside the facility consuming the last of its structure. Steel beams groaned and collapsed, sending shock waves through the tarmac as parts of the building caved inward. The air grew thick with smoke, the night sky painted in orange and black. Wexler exhaled sharply, sweat and blood dripping down his face. His once polished exterior was long gone, his suit torn, his breathing ragged. And yet, his eyes still burned with something wild, something defiant. "You don't get it, do you?" he rasped, his voice hoarse from the smoke and exhaustion. "You think this is justice? You think this is victory?" Zephyrus adjusted his stance, his muscles tense but controlled. "I think you talk too much." Wexler let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "You're not stopping anything." His fingers flexed, his mind still searching for an opening, for a way out. "You take me down? Someone else takes my place. That's how the world works," Kyrian smirked. "Then we'll keep burning them down." For the first time, Wexler's smirk faltered. Cassiel moved first. He feinted high, forcing Wexler's guard up, before shifting into a low, spinning kick fast, efficient, calculated. Wexler reacted too late. The kick connected. Wexler's legs were swept out from under him, his balance completely shattered. He hit the ground with a brutal crack, his skull bouncing off the pavement. Zephyrus was on him before he could recover, pinning him down with a knee pressed into his chest. Wexler thrashed, his movements still wild, refusing to accept defeat. His hand darted toward his waist, reaching for a hidden blade, but Kyrian stomped down on his wrist, pinning it to the ground with a sickening crunch. Wexler let out a sharp grunt of pain, his body twisting in resistance, but it was over. Cassiel removed a pair of industrial-grade flex cuffs from his gear, wrenching Wexler's arms behind his back and locking them in place. He was captured. The world around them continued to collapse, fire consuming everything. The airstrip shaking as the final detonations deep within the facility sent shock waves through the ground. Zephyrus stood, his breath steady despite the battle, his eyes locked onto Wexler's broken form. The once untouchable mastermind lay defeated at their feet. The flames roared louder, the final remnants of his empire crumbling into nothing. Kyrian exhaled, cracking his knuckles as he nudged Wexler's leg with his boot. "Not so untouchable now, huh?" Wexler turned his head slightly, his eyes still sharp, despite the pain racking his body. Even in defeat, he refused to beg. "You think you've won?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the fire raging behind them. Zephyrus looked down at him, his face unreadable. "No," he murmured. "We just ended you." The flames behind them raged, the night sky illuminated by the destruction of everything Wexler had built. They had watched the horror unfold, not as entertainment, but as undeniable proof of what had been happening in the shadows for years. The footage, the blood-stained battleground, the screams of the fallen, the desperate pleas of the hunters when they realized they had become prey, was released into the world like a virus, impossible to contain. News outlets scrambled to verify it, government agencies launched investigations, and the public, for the first time, saw the faces of the men who had treated human lives as nothing more than sport. The list of names was long. Powerful figures, CEOs, politicians, military officials, generational wealth that had built its empire on cruelty. Their faces flooded television screens, social media feeds, and front-page headlines, each one stamped with accusations of their involvement in the hunt. Some of them denied it immediately. Others vanished overnight, and a few, realizing the gravity of what was coming, took the coward's way out, found dead in their mansions before the authorities could arrest them. But the truth was out, and there was no hiding from it anymore. Far from the chaos, the triplets remained in the shadows. They had done their part. Now, the world would tear itself apart, handling the aftermath. Kirian leaned against a rusted guardrail on the edge of a desolate dockyard, the faint scent of salt and gasoline drifting through the cold air. The distant city skyline was alive with flashing sirens, a storm of arrests, cover-ups, and confessions unraveling in real time. "They're eating each other alive," Kirian murmured, watching a live news report flicker on a nearby warehouse screen. The headline scrolled across the bottom in bold, unrelenting text. "The elite hunt exposed. Global conspiracy unraveled." Cassiel stood a few steps away, watching the footage play on his burner phone. A dozen high-profile figures had already been taken into custody, their faces pale and haggard as they were dragged from their penthouses and private estates. The world had turned on them in a matter of hours. "We did what we had to do," Cassiel muttered, tucking the phone away. "But this isn't over. It never will be." Zephyrus sat on the edge of a cargo container, his forearms resting on his knees, his expression unreadable as he listened to the distant sounds of a world trying to make sense of its own darkness. "They'll never stop," he said finally. "Even if the hunt is over, even if they lose everything, they'll rebuild in the shadows." His gaze drifted toward the black waves, stretching endlessly into the night. "Monsters like this don't die. They adapt." Kirian exhaled sharply, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "Then we make sure there's nothing left for them to rebuild." They had tied up every loose end. Every encrypted file, every transaction, every link to the network that had funded the hunt had been traced and burned. Every hidden bunker, every secretive meeting ground had been exposed. The remaining hunters, the ones who had survived the fire, had disappeared into the wind, but not before the triplets ensured they would never return. Wexler had disappeared into a black site prison, his name erased, his influence stripped away, locked away with the ghosts of every life he had destroyed. And Bishop Rourke? The last predator to fall. Somewhere, buried beneath the rubble of the collapsed facility, his legacy rotted. There was no coming back from this, but there was also no going back for them. The world would never know who they were. Their names would never be spoken in victory. They would never be celebrated as heroes. Hey, weren't heroes. They were a necessary consequence. Cassiel pulled a duffel bag from beneath the dock railing, unzipping it with a measured precision before tossing it onto the ground. His voice was calm, final. "We disappear. No footprints. No shadows. No second chances." Kirian exhaled, his lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "And when they try again?" Zephyrus rolled his shoulders, the weight of unfinished wars settling in his bones. He didn't hesitate. "Then we erase them." Without another word, the triplets stepped into the darkness, slipping away like ghosts. The world would remember the truth, but it would never know the men who had set it free. The world had seen the unfiltered truth, the brutality, the corruption, the faces of the men who had orchestrated it all from behind glass towers and untouchable wealth. There was no denying it anymore. The footage had done more than expose them. It had set fire to everything they had built. Powerful figures who had once ruled without consequence were dragged into the light. Arrests were made, fortunes were seized, networks collapsed overnight. Some of the men responsible tried to fight the accusations. Others vanished into the wind, hoping to escape the consequences of their sins. A few, realizing there was no way out, chose death over the shame of being hunted. But the world had turned against them, and for the first time, they were the ones who felt the fear. The triplets had won, and yet there was no celebration, no moment of victory, because men like them were never meant to exist in the daylight. A cold wind swept across the dockyard, carrying the scent of salt, oil, and rust. The city skyline in the distance was alive with flashing sirens, A storm of consequences unraveling in real time. Cassiel leaned against the hood of an old pickup truck, watching the latest headlines flash across a discarded tablet screen. Another CEO arrested. Another name added to the growing list of those who had fallen. The hunt had collapsed. Wilkes turned himself in, Cassiel murmured, reading through the latest report. Cut a deal. Looks like he gave them everything. Korean let out a sharp breath, flicking the cap of a lighter open and closed, the small flame flickering before vanishing each time. The others? Cassiel tossed the tablet into the duffel bag beside him. Running, hiding, dying, same as the rest. Korean smirked, shaking his head. Kinda poetic, isn't it? They spent their whole lives hunting people. Now they're the ones being hunted. He glanced at Zephyrus, whose eyes were still fixed on the distant skyline, silent in thought. Cassiel zipped the duffel closed. We tied up every loose end. There's nothing left for us here. Zephyrus finally turned to face them, his expression unreadable, but the weight that had rested on his shoulders since the moment this all started was gone. Korean exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck before rolling his shoulders loose. Feels weird, doesn't it? Cassiel raised an eyebrow. What does? Korean gestured toward the city, toward the world still spinning beyond them. The fact that it's over. He scoffed, shaking his head. All this time, we've been looking over our shoulders, fighting, running, surviving. And now? He let the question linger. Now, there's nothing left to do. Zephyrus met his gaze. Then we walk away. Korean blinked, a small, incredulous laugh escaping him. Just like that? Cassiel slung the duffel bag over his shoulder, his voice calm, certain. Just like that. Because this wasn't a mission anymore. There was no next step. No more trails to follow. For the first time, there was nothing left unfinished. Zephyrus gave the city skyline one last look, watching as the fires they had started burned the last remnants of the hunt into history. Then, without another word, he turned away. Cassiel followed. Korean let out a slow breath, rolling the lighter between his fingers one last time before flicking it shut and stuffing it into his pocket. Then he turned and walked with them. No words were needed. No goodbyes were given. The world would remember the hunt, the horrors, the victims, the reckoning that followed, but the men who ended it, they left no names, no stories, only the ashes of what once was. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.